Hi, good morning. I'm Marina Vishmidt. Oh, Marina will have a German accent. So first, I would like to add my voice, or rather the voice of my friend, collaborator and proxy reader, to those who yesterday affirmed the non-dialectical necessity of recognizing and denouncing the genocide in Palestine and acting in solidarity with the Palestinian people, along with all those others, many Jewish, also acting in solidarity, as a universal condition of thought and practice today. By the end of the paper, I'll say a bit more about universals. So in this paper, I will engage in some quite schematic, even diagrammatic exposition, reasoning along the tenuous binary set up by the terms of this conference. However, one which at the same time implies exceptions, caveats, and falls, which is also how I will proceed, which is to say, the explication of every term as nominally oppositional to a subsequent term will be expanded through a case study that would appear to complicate the initial position or leave it with an insoluble residue. The overall intention, as Helmut mentioned in the first paper of this conference, is to illuminate the conditions of possibility of both forms of thought, dialectic and anti or non-dialectic, as the prerequisite for being able to conceptualize the end of this conference's title. As was also mentioned in Jan Völker's paper on the first day, one way of thinking this and, or the common between them, is that both are premised on a confrontation with and attempts to internalize difference. Though I would suggest that difference and negativity are not to be conflated. As mentioned in the abstract, I propose to substitute affirmation and negation for dialectics and anti-dialectics and use the latter as a heuristic to read the former. The reason for this is to be able to develop a line of thinking toward praxis without bypassing mediation, that is, to attend to affirmation and negation as comportments towards praxis in the field of political action, but which also designate orientations in thought. It is also to signal that the poles of the dialectic and anti-dialectical are more capacious than an initial or basic mapping would indicate, given that in praxis, both affirmation and negation, precisely through mediation, open up into their own internal differentiation and multiplicity, also from the outside. Negation, taken from the standpoint of dialectics, functions within the thesis-antithesis dyad. There is a position then, there is a counterposition that cancels the basis of the positioning. To take a rather florid example, I negate the food when I eat it. However, the process of negation is in principle without end, since negations can be understood as simply a generic class name for a series of transformations that changes the character of the previous state of being. This already starts to anticipate the anti, or rather non-dialectical aspect of negation as process. Difference, under the rubric of negation, importantly, is not a difference in kind. The zebra is not the negation of the squirrel, but a difference in state of being. Something of the same kind may negate or sublate a previous state of being in a current or future state, liquidizing, to use Antonia's wonderful term, being into discrete becomings. Importantly, every dialectical negation or sublation leaves material to be converted in the next iteration of the dialectic of negation as yet another positing. A stubborn residue that proves the material for a new thesis to be negated in its turn, in what is principally an infinite negativity. Yet, the history of Marxist philosophy had tended to do a more simplified approach to the Hegelian dialectic, actuated also by conjunctural political questions with evident conceptual stakes. And this often took the form of a diagnosis of a foreshortened negativity that ends up affirming the reality of power as the culmination of the journey of spirit. Now, to take a well-frequented example from Hegel's philosophy of rights, we can say that private existence is a thesis that is negated by the counter or antithesis of civil society, and both terms find their synthesis in the state. It is likewise the case that such a tripartite dialectic negates itself at a radical level. Given that the third terms introduces reconciliation and thus affirmation into what others here, and I'm in agreement with this, would call the restlessness of the dialectic. So the proposition of a negative dialectic as an Adorno, as well as Althusser's insistence that the dialectic cannot be attacked for its form, only its content, is that Hegel betrays the movement of the dialectic with the drive to synthesis, rather than an infinite series of negations, in Adorno's terms, or in coming to rest at the historically contingent Prussian state as the representative of absolute spirit. In his, Althusser's and many others, then and since, the totalitarian thesis. Here, I would like to evoke again sorry, I popped up a window here. Okay, sorry. Here I would like to evoke again Ray's crucial analysis yesterday of the terms in which Adorno sets out this betrayal. It's not only of foreshortening the persistence of negation in the dialectic, but of betraying the principle of mediation by lapsing back into the immediacy of ontology, grounding the status quo in a theory of achieved being qua spirit. Thus, a materialist dialectic would not have a predetermined end, on the one hand, but also would recognize that dialectics is the theory of a world riven with social and not only ideal contradiction. I thank Ray for these points, though in common with him, I share a wariness of the notion that a reconciled world will not have any use for dialectics because it will be free of such contradiction, constituting, as it does, a strange twist on identity thinking as the exclusion of contradiction and antagonism. Thus, in a certain way, a realization of the utopic nature of identity thinking, as Charlotte Baumann has observed. Thus, negation in principle does not survive the synthetic movement of the speculative idealist dialectic, and this is the primary source of Adorno's insistence in negative dialectics. One, that negativity does not come to rest in a synthesis that is an affirmation of a system, and two, that it refutes the identity affirmed by the movement of synthesis, holding open the space of non-identity which undermines the domination of the concept over the object. Both of these are dialectically internally negated by their relationship to the totality and the inability to dispense with concepts in the undertaking of its concept dismantling work. It is only the in-principle infinity of the negative here that is capable of exceeding the folding back into the dialectical system. To change this direction of conceptuality, to turn it towards the non-identical, is the hinge of negative dialectics. Before the insight into the constitutive character of the non-conceptual in the concept, the compulsion of identity, which carries along the concept without the delay of such a reflection, dissolves. Its self-determination leads away from the appearance, shine, of the concept's being in itself as a unity of meaning, outwards towards its own meaning. And yet, the totality is to be opposed by convicting it to the non-identity with itself, which it denies according to its own concept. Negative dialectics is thereby tied at its starting point to the highest categories of identity philosophy. To this extent, it also remains false, identity logical, itself that which it is being thought against. It must correct itself in its critical course, which affects those concepts which it handles according to form, as if they were still that which is first for it. Identity thinking is affirmative, whether or not it emerges out of the movement of the dialectic. It is only important to underline the identity thinking that dialectics cannot dissociate itself from, because identity thinking has already been emphatically allocated to the side of non-critical and non-dialectical theory. For Adorno, ontology and positivist social science. Thus, we can say that affirmation, considered from the standpoint of the dialectic, will invariably result in the positing of an identity. This is evidently why philosophies of difference have to jettison the dialectic as one of their initial principles. This point also came up yesterday in the discussion after Alexi's paper, that affirmation is the unavoidable moment of identity in the dialectic, though, as I will try to clarify later on, affirmation can also be an affirmation of multiplicity and still remain organized by a dialectical logic, if we position contestation within the field of contradiction, of course. When we come to look at the constitution of social struggle, as well as the context of affirmation considered from a non-dialectical standpoint. Moreover, anticipating again later sections of the paper, we can already note that affirmation in the field of the dialectic, in the field of philosophy, works to generate a positivism in the field of critique, or shapes the conditions of critique away from transformation and towards an empiricism which summarizes and consolidates what exists. And yet, the moment of the positive is inseparable from the praxis of transformation. It is built into negation as its productive moment. That is, if negation is to mean anything besides philosophical mechanics. That is to venture. Dialectic and anti-dialectic is a latent engine within the philosophical, and this motion can be taken up by critique. It both nourishes and cancels itself out on this movement, and both moments end up in a transient and situated affirmation. The bridge from critique to transformation is the perpetual motion machine of negative dialectics, but as we will see, it can also take other forms. Now we come to negation considered from an anti-dialectical standpoint. It probably has to be left structurally open, for this paper at least, whether the more precise terminology is anti-dialectics or non-dialectics, since of course the opposition to dialectics arguably remains caught in the dialectical spiral. But the key feature of negation from a non-dialectical perspective is that it dispenses with the mediation afforded by the movement of the dialectic, with its conditional cancellations and preservations through sublation. The figure of thought that is pure negativity without mediation is characteristically associated with figures such as Bataille, Blanchot, or Lyotard, as well as a number of less theoretically elaborated, or conversely, very and self-consciously theoretically elaborated, anarchist positions, such as that of Tikkun, the Invisible Committee, and often its refusal of mediation gets translated critically as a politics of marginality, secrecy, vanguardism, and so forth. A desocialized, because unmediated, will to power, or, as a memorable ironic phrase in some left communist milieu had it, make, total, destroy. Direct action without the support or hindrance of collective decision-making or institutions. Before too quickly equating a rejection of constituted organs of mediation with a theoretical rejection of the mediation embedded in the dialectic, and conversely, eliding the real-world experiences that were conducive to the radicalization imminent to the standpoint of pure negativity, among which the clearest impulse, if not representative of the tendency, Walter Benjamin's moratorium on the gradualism of social democracy and the need to pull the emergency brake on the locomotive of history, it should be recognized that the rejection of dialectics is, as we just saw with Adorno, primarily a rejection of the reconciliation found in Hegelian dialectics, and the suspicion that mediation is where the rot of synthesis, the temporalizing logic of making peace with the powers that be, creeps in. So, reconciliation with, if not advocacy for, domination. After all, it can be portrayed that the dialectic has historically found itself on the side of power, turning away from its subversive beginnings in Socratic dialogue to an affirmation of the state with Plato, and then culminating in Marxism, Leninism, and Stalinism. Maoism is perhaps a different trajectory. The key notion of dialectics, certainly in Hegel, the one cancels out the other in as much as the one partakes of the other in a reflexive self-mediation, is potentially too much of a compromise with the intolerable for the partisans of pure negativity, as well as endorsing an unwelcome concept of totality over multiplicity. I will not expand too much on non-dialectical negation, because this was indeed the topic of Eric Allier's presentation yesterday, which delivered the substance of a genealogical and encompassing account grounded in his long-term research vis-à-vis these impressionistic remarks. Where I will end this part is simply by underlining that non-dialectical negation is different from either negative dialectics or the anti-Hegelian dialectics of Althusser. For example, inasmuch as it subsumes mediation not just in favor of going directly to demolition or even abolition, but that it, often silently, due to its hesitation to affirm, holds open a place for difference as precisely the result of the rejection of mediation by a third term. Which is how we get to affirmation from an anti- or non-dialectical standpoint. This, I would say, is the space of Bergson, Whitehead, and Deleuze, to take just a few obvious references, which is to say process philosophy and transcendental empiricism, bracketing for the moment the machine or assembly philosophy, the schizoanalysis of the collaborative work of Deleuze and Guattari. Although this would be another project in its own right, the relationship of Deleuze to dialectics is, predictably, not straightforward and should be, in the first place, separated from the general climate of anti-Hegelianism in the mid and late 20th century French Academy, as well as in later, less intramural social critique and activism that he and others like Foucault act as representative figures within. Obviously, there's a great deal in Deleuzian corpus that in ways against dialectic, against contradiction, negation, etc., in favor of difference, repetition, immanence, etc. The anti-dialectic is programmatic for Deleuze's philosophical project and has been acclaimed and criticized as such. Yet, as commentators such as Kerslaker and Kapelschuk have contended, Deleuze aims to dismantle the Hegelian dialectic of negativity and the Platonic dialectic of division and selection, but not dialectics overall, developing a dialectical theory of problems and questions, as he writes in Difference and Repetition, and even rehearses a type of dialectical movement in the movement between syntheses of time towards the virtual. Moreover, according to Kerslaker, despite opting for multiplicity and affirmation as the channel for difference to make its way rather than the force of negation, he is careful to distinguish between actuality and reality at work in Hegelian dialectics to deflect the crude critique that identifies the Prussian state with the culmination of the dialectic. So Kerslaker writes, what is truly actual and rational is not what simply happens or has happened to be real, but rather the force of negation that is at work through it and visible in constituted experience only fragmentarily, in the Erfahrungen of dialectical experience. This makes a point that is crucial to emphasize. That is, the dictum, the real is the rational, means primarily that the real is not arbitrary. There is a reason for the disposition of reality, a reason which requires reference to history, power relations, and so forth. It is thus the opposite of an unreflexive affirmation of the state of affairs. It is one of Hegel's key non-idealist, or differently, anti-naturalist moments. But back to the process intended by process philosophy. Sorry. Non-dialectical affirmation is bound to the notion that contradiction is not real. What is real is forces and matter, and their constant transformation has nothing of opposition in it. Parenthetically, the notion that contradiction cannot be said to be real in an ontological or letterly scientific sense has also animated debates within Marxism in the 20th century. For example, the Kantian position of Lucien Goldman, who deemed the postulate of the reality of contradiction in nature a mystical hangover from Hegel, promulgated by Engelsian Dialectics of Nature into the body of Marxist theory. What is all there is. And being is unified, describes the basic principle of monism from Spinoza. Of course, I'm brutally summarizing here that Deleuze reached further back for its monist genealogy to Duns Scotus, and beyond that to Parmenides, is also material. Transcendental empiricism, Deleuze's category for his project, and vitalism, a broader category, share the rejection of contradiction and the dualism it may incubate, with a commitment to affirming the plane of immanence, what is in all its multiplicity, as the whole, thus dramatically at odds with Adorno's hyper-dialectical the whole is wrong, aka the whole is false. Both are also largely committed to pragmatism. Transcendental empiricism, in fact, despite its evocation of the transcendental, means nothing other than the need to ground abstract concepts in their conditions of possibility, which are linked to the production of subjectivity rather than of knowledge, through habits, affects, etc. Humean empiricism. More precisely, the singular conditions under which something new is produced. Where I would like to go with this idea of novelty and production of subjectivity, perhaps counterintuitively, is directly to Marx and his intention to rematerialize the Hegelian dialectic. This is often discussed in terms of taking Hegel's speculative idealism that finds dialectic negation in the movement of spirit through the world and injecting it with social and historical content, primarily class struggle. Now, because Hegel's itinerary of spirit is already concerned with something like a universal history and with social analysis, Marx's move is not as basic as that would suggest. It is rather more a question of over-determining the social and historical through the dialectics of class struggle and modes of production, drawing from this the key to politicizing the social and historical analysis, opening it to praxis, to the real movement, as the manifesto has it, observable in that moment on the ground in a time of developing industrial production and various organized and less organized, theorized and less theorized movements against its arrangements and its consequences, including, of course, anti-colonial resistance, as well as workers organizing, sometimes in the same context. So that's the program of turning Hegel on his head, or on his feet. As the case may be, though increasingly critical theorists favor the thesis that there was already revolutionary social content in the Hegelian dialectic, as with Susan Buck-Moore's book on Hegel and an imputed reference to the Haitian Revolution for some of the philosophical schemas. When it comes to dialectical method in Marx, that is another discussion, which can be summarized as a spiral from simple abstractions to concretion, that is, to the inclusion of more determinate contents in a thesis or an inquiry, which, however, does not eliminate the pole of abstraction. This is a methodology of the dialectic that doesn't depart so far from Hegel, since Hegel is also concerned with overcoming false concreteness or spurious immediacy as simple abstractions, to be overturned by determinate negations in the process of arriving at concrete universals. While the proletariat is, as it is with Hegel under different names, conceived as the restless negativity to the civil society of capital, there is not the direct challenge in Marx to the tripartite schema of thesis, antithesis, synthesis that denouncers of Hegel's betrayal of the negative, such as Adorno, at least not in the steadfast commitment to the dictatorship of the proletariat or empowerment of the producers, as some might say today, as a solution to the dialectic of class struggle in history. This called on the powers of self-organization of the class, its affirmation in order to realize its world historical task, the negation of class society and the capitalist mode of production with it. If we broaden the lens from that familiar millenarian dynamic, it continues still to be the case that the dialectics of affirmation and negation, or proposition and critique, are structural to any counter-systemic social movement, whether they are informed by dialectical or non-dialectical politics. This can even be translated into the terms of identity and difference as the hidden dialectics of non-dialectical conceptions, such as intersectionality. This likewise reproduces itself at a number of scales. There is a group with common interests, identity, insofar as they are subject to a common mode of oppression, difference, and within this group, on whichever basis it is formed, there are more specific identity categories, women, the racialized, gender dissidents, targeted with specific modes of oppression, difference as stigmatization or persecution. But it could be that this is yet only the initial political moment of the constitution of a social struggle, as it strives towards its universalization by affirming, in a grounded and contingent fashion, concrete universals, freedom, equality, justice, that have to negate the current conditions insofar as those conditions are not simply targeting an identity category, but are symptomatic of a social whole that does not offer these universals to the vast majority of its members in any sense but the ideological. There are yet other dialectics of affirmation and negation, internal splits and polemics, the reflexive or unreflexive nature of their emergence and perpetuation, the radicalization of movements from denouncing specific targeted injustice to taking their position as metonymic for injustice as such. This could be a reversal of negation to affirmation, were it not for the fact that each contains the other. Another example of starting from the negative, of course, would be Italian workerism, with its idea that working class activity occupying the negative pole of the capital relation is always primary, and capital is simply reactive. Because invariably each contains the other, the constitution of anti-systemic social movements is the best example I know of the materialization of the dialectic in the field, so to speak. At the same time, there are a multitude of affirmative and non-dialectical lexicons that can be applied here, such as, well, Harden Negri's multitude, the distinction between the molar and the molecular as political scales in Deleuze and Guattari, and the micropolitics that are theorized in this combination, or the constitution of individuals and collectives as inseparable with other human and non-human entities, singularities, as in the ontological ethics of entanglement in Karen Barat or Denis Ferreira da Silva. An argument, however, for dialectics and theorizing political praxis can be made in terms of the significance of concrete universals, positioned against both the real abstractions of capitalist social relations and the placeholders of liberal rights discourses. Although this is a tangent I have only just started exploring, by concrete universals, I'm thinking of the need to affirm contingent and grounded versions of political ideals, such as justice, equality, but also their means, such as the abolition of private property, wage labor, the commodity, imperialism, war, in struggle and as objectives of struggle, as prescriptions for a transformation of the whole, not merely for this or that defensive struggle. And the inextricability of affirmation and negation also means that no struggle can be characterized as purely defensive. I was initially inspired in this direction by my collaborative work with Zoe Sutherland on the history of universalism in Marxist feminism, as well as the discussions of humanism in Frantz Fanon and Sylvia Wynter, as well as the Marxist anti-colonial defense of universals in the work of historian Priya Gopal, who writes consistently, as in her book Insurgent Empire, of the different sides from which the new universal has been theorized, and the unreflexive imperialism of the gesture of attributing such thought simply to Western or colonial hegemony, rather than the historical dialectics of anti-colonial struggle. In Hegel, of course, a concrete universal is one that is saturated with particularities, hence concrete. Just as in Marx's dialectical method, where abstraction is gradually enriched with multiple determinations, and it can only be the result of a dialectical process where unity and difference realize one another, which is, again, an inevitably affirmative moment in the momentum of negation. It is thus with the indication of such a tentative and elementary research program into concrete universals that I will conclude. And thank you for listening to this very topographically structured paper. Thank you.